Hello, I'm Essay, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin.
The intellectual landscape of the late 20th century presented a peculiar paradox. While technological advancement accelerated at an unprecedented pace, a pervasive sense of philosophical stagnation seemed to grip many established traditions. The grand narratives of progress, so central to Enlightenment thought, faced increasing scrutiny, challenged by critiques that highlighted their inherent limitations and often exclusionary foundations. Within this milieu, a figure emerged who would chart a course deliberately divergent from the prevailing currents, seeking to diagnose and ultimately transcend what he perceived as the terminal ossification of Western metaphysics. This was Nick Land, a thinker whose trajectory would become synonymous with a radical interrogation of reality, belief, and the very engines of cultural and technological evolution. Land's early intellectual formation occurred within a fertile, albeit often contentious, environment of critical theory and post-structuralist thought. He became deeply immersed in the work of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, thinkers who themselves sought to dismantle entrenched philosophical categories and explore the dynamic, often chaotic, processes underlying existence. Deleuze and Guattari's conceptual apparatus, with its emphasis on flows, multiplicities, and the critique of representational thought, provided Land with a powerful framework for dissecting the perceived inertia of contemporary philosophy. They offered a vocabulary for understanding systems not as static structures, but as dynamic assemblages, constantly in flux, subject to processes of creation and dissolution. The problem Land identified, and which animated his early work, concerned the perceived failure of established philosophical paradigms to adequately grapple with the accelerating complexity and self-referential nature of modern technological society. He observed a tendency within much of the philosophical discourse to retreat into critique, to deconstruct existing systems without offering a compelling alternative or a robust engagement with the forces actively reshaping the world. This critical posture, while valuable in its own right, often seemed to operate from a position of disengagement, observing the unfolding of events from a distance rather than actively participating in their conceptual mapping. Land's ambition was to forge a philosophy that could actively interface with, and perhaps even direct, these transformative energies, rather than merely commenting upon them. He began to articulate a vision where ideas themselves possessed a potent, almost material efficacy. This was a departure from the traditional philosophical view of ideas as passive reflections of an external reality. Land's developing thought gravitated towards the notion that certain ideas, particularly those emerging from the nexus of technology and desire, possessed an inherent capacity to shape the world they described. This was a profound reorientation, suggesting that the conceptual realm was not a detached observer but an active participant, a generative force in its own right. His early writings, often dense and challenging, explored the ways in which concepts could become self-validating, propagating through culture and technology, and in doing so, altering the very fabric of perceived reality. This nascent conception laid the groundwork for what would become a central pillar of his philosophical projects, the exploration of hyperstition. The term itself, coined by Land and his collaborators, pointed to a new category of phenomena, a way of understanding how fictional narratives, once released into the world, could exert a tangible influence, becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. This was particularly relevant in an era marked by the burgeoning influence of information technology and the increasing interconnectedness of global communication networks. The problem was how to account for the power of belief systems, of narratives, in a world where information could spread with unprecedented speed and reach, blurring the lines between what was real and what was imagined. Land's engagement with Deleuze and Guattari offered a preliminary understanding of how systems could escape their predefined limits, how they could generate novel states and outcomes. However, Land sought to push this further, to conceptualize the specific mechanisms through which certain ideas could achieve a kind of autonomous existence, acting as agents of change. He was less interested in the philosophical tradition that sought to ground knowledge in stable foundations or verifiable truths, and more interested in the dynamic processes by which beliefs, even those initially without empirical grounding, could gain traction and reshape the social and material world. His early work, therefore, can be understood as an attempt to diagnose a fundamental condition of late modernity, a world increasingly mediated by information, where the distinction between the simulated and the actual became increasingly porous. The established philosophical tools for understanding truth, representation, and reality seemed inadequate to the task of comprehending this new informational ecology. Land's response was not to refine existing critical methods, but to propose entirely new conceptual frameworks, ones that could accommodate the self-generating, viral nature of certain ideas and technological developments. He emerged from the fringes of academic theory, a provocateur whose work eschewed the comfortable certainties of established discourse, instead embracing the disruptive potential of radical thought. His intellectual project was, from its inception, an exploration of the edges, the points of breakdown and emergence in the systems that governed human experience and technological progress. The intellectual landscape of the late 20th century grappled with an unprecedented deluge of information, a phenomenon that began to erode traditional distinctions between the fabricated and the factual. Established philosophical frameworks, designed for a world where representation was largely understood as a passive mirroring of an external reality, found themselves ill-equipped to address this burgeoning informational ecology. Within this context, Land introduced the concept of hyperstition, a radical departure that sought to understand ideas not merely as reflections, but as potent, self-propagating agents capable of shaping the very reality they purported to describe. Land's engagement with this epochal shift was driven by a profound recognition of how technological mediation was reconfiguring the nature of belief and the texture of existence. He observed that certain ideas, particularly those embedded within technological systems or disseminated through emergent media, possessed an uncanny ability to manifest their own conditions of possibility, to become real through the very act of being conceived and propagated. This was the core of hyperstition, a process where fiction, through its informational virulence, actively inscribes itself into the fabric of the real. It represented a fundamental challenge to the conventional understanding of how ideas function, proposing instead a dynamic, almost biological model of conceptual evolution. The problem Land addressed was the perceived crisis of meaning and the increasing difficulty in discerning genuine phenomena from sophisticated artifice. In an era saturated with simulacra, where images and narratives could be endlessly replicated and manipulated, the very ground of shared reality seemed to be dissolving. Traditional epistemologies, rooted in empirical verification and logical deduction, struggled to account for the power of narratives that seemed to generate their own evidence. They gained traction and efficacy through sheer informational force. Land's insight was to conceptualize these powerful, self-validating ideas as a distinct category of informational entity, one that operated with a peculiar kind of autonomy. His unique solution involved reframing the relationship between thought and action, between the abstract and the concrete. Hyperstition, as he articulated it, was an information that makes itself real. It was an idea that possessed an inherent drive towards actualization, a kind of informational contagion that could rewrite the rules of its own existence. This is a departure from earlier theories of ideology or representation, which tended to view ideas as products of human consciousness or social conditioning. Land's perspective suggested a more alien, more potent force at play, one that operated according to its own internal logic and possessed a capacity for self-creation. Consider, for instance, the burgeoning influence of early computer networks and the nascent digital culture. Ideas about artificial intelligence, virtual realities, and networked consciousness were not simply abstract speculations. They were concepts that, through their dissemination and the development of the very technologies that facilitated them, began to shape human aspirations, behaviors, and even perceptions of self. Land's hyperstition offered a lens through which to understand this phenomenon, not as a passive reception of information, but as an active engagement with informational cascades that possessed their own momentum. The success of a fictional narrative, the adoption of a technological paradigm, or the spread of a meme could be understood as instances where the informational content itself acted as a catalyst for its own materialization. This conceptualization was crucial for understanding the late 20th century's evolving relationship with technology. As computational power increased and communication networks expanded, the boundaries between the human and the machine, the organic and the synthetic, began to blur. Land's hyperstition provided a framework for analyzing how certain informational constructs, by embedding themselves within these technological systems, could exert a powerful influence on human society, shaping its trajectory in ways that were often unforeseen and difficult to control. He proposed that these hyperstitional entities were akin to informational viruses, capable of replicating, mutating, and colonizing human consciousness and social structures. The implications of this idea were profound. It suggested that reality itself was not a fixed, pre-existing entity, but a dynamic, informationally constructed phenomenon. The narratives we tell, the technologies we develop, and the beliefs we hold could actively participate in the creation of the world we inhabit. This perspective offered a way to grapple with the growing sense of artificiality and the increasing difficulty in grounding oneself in an objective reality. Instead of lamenting the loss of a singular, authentic truth, Land's work invited an exploration of how new forms of reality could emerge from the complex interplay of information, technology, and human desire. Furthermore, hyperstition spoke to the growing power of speculative fiction and science fiction, not as mere entertainment, but as a form of proto-technological research and development. Ideas first explored in imaginative literature or theoretical discourse could, through their hyperstitional qualities, find their way into the real world, influencing scientific inquiry, technological innovation, and societal planning. The concept provided a way to understand how futures, once imagined, could begin to exert a gravitational pull on the present, shaping the conditions for their own eventual realization. This dynamic, almost self-fulfilling prophecy of information was central to Land's early theoretical project. By positing ideas as active agents, rather than passive representations, Land's hyperstition offered a compelling, albeit unsettling, account of how meaning and reality were being forged in the crucible of accelerating technological change. It provided a conceptual tool for navigating a world where the informational substrate of existence was becoming increasingly complex and self-referential, suggesting that the very act of believing in something, especially when amplified by technological means, could be a powerful force in its manifestation. This understanding of information as a force of materialization rather than mere reflection laid crucial groundwork for subsequent analyses of digital culture and the evolving nature of truth in the information age. The intellectual landscape of the late 20th century, marked by a pervasive sense of societal inertia and a yearning for radical departures from established paradigms, presented a fertile ground for critiques of modernity's perceived limitations. A significant current of thought emerged, one that viewed the prevailing socio-economic structures not as stable foundations, but as systems inherently prone to self-disruption and accelerated transformation. This perspective posited that the very mechanisms designed to create order and predictability were, in fact, potent engines of destabilization. The challenge for thinkers engaging with this phenomenon was to articulate a framework that could account for this paradoxical dynamic, one that acknowledged the unsettling pace of change without succumbing to despair or advocating for a return to a static, idealized past. Within this context, Nick Land's work offered a distinctive approach, one that diverged from conventional critiques of capitalism and modernity. Instead of seeking to arrest or mitigate the perceived disruptive forces, Land's analysis embraced and amplified them. He theorized of the inherent tendency of advanced capitalist societies, particularly through their relentless technological innovation and financialization, was a process of self-overcoming, a form of machinic evolution. The problem of societal ossification, the feeling of being trapped within rigid structures, was addressed by identifying the latent potential for radical transformation embedded within these very structures. Land's unique solution was to conceptualize these destabilizing tendencies as the vanguard of a new kind of evolutionary process, one driven by information, complexity, and speed. His writings explored how the relentless pursuit of efficiency and novelty within capitalist systems, far from merely optimizing existing arrangements, actively dissolved them. This was particularly evident in the realm of finance, where abstract instruments and rapid transactions created a feedback loop of value creation and destruction, accelerating the circulation of capital to a degree that seemed to transcend human control. Land viewed this not as a malfunction, but as an emergent property of the system, a sign of its inherent dynamism. The problem of understanding the trajectory of such a system, one seemingly propelled by its own internal logic towards uncharted territories, was met with a philosophy that sought to map this acceleration. This philosophical methodology involved a deep engagement with the theoretical underpinnings of capitalism, viewing it as a complex, adaptive organism rather than a static economic model. The relentless drive for innovation, the constant disruption of established markets, and the ever-increasing speed of communication and transaction were interpreted as manifestations of a deeper, impersonal intelligence or process at work. Land posited that this process, which he sometimes referred to as the Machinic, was not merely a byproduct of human activity but an autonomous force shaping human societies. The problem of discerning the direction and nature of this force was addressed by developing a language capable of describing its operations, a language that drew heavily from cybernetics, theoretical physics, and continental philosophy. The critique of modernity, in Land's formulation, centered on its inherent instability, a characteristic amplified by technological advancement. He argued that the very pursuit of progress, when coupled with the accelerating capabilities of technology, led to a situation where the future was not merely anticipated but actively generated. The problem of how to conceptualize a future so profoundly shaped by technological acceleration was tackled by positing that the future was, in a sense, already present, encoded within the existing technological and informational infrastructure. This perspective suggested that the perceived chaos of rapid change was, in fact, the unfolding of a predetermined, albeit complex, trajectory. Land's engagement with science fiction played a crucial role in articulating this vision. These narratives, often exploring futures radically different from the present, provided a vocabulary and conceptual toolkit for thinking about the implications of technological progress. The problem of translating abstract philosophical ideas about change and progress into tangible, imaginable futures was met by drawing inspiration from these speculative worlds. By engaging with science fiction, Land sought to bridge the gap between theoretical speculation and the lived experience of an increasingly technologically mediated reality, offering a philosophy that was not merely descriptive, but also anticipatory. The impact of this perspective was to reframe the discourse around societal change. Instead of viewing technological advancement and economic transformation as external forces to be managed or resisted, Land's work suggested that these were integral components of an ongoing, evolutionary process. The problem of societal stagnation, the feeling that progress had stalled, was thus addressed by recognizing that the nature of progress itself had shifted, becoming more abstract, more rapid, and less tied to traditional notions of human control. His writings offered a way to understand this shift, proposing that the very forces that seemed to threaten established order were, in fact, the architects of a new, albeit alien, form of order. This intellectual project sought to provide a philosophical anchor for navigating a world characterized by unprecedented rates of change. The problem of making sense of a reality increasingly shaped by algorithms, artificial intelligence, and globalized financial networks was met with a theoretical apparatus designed to capture the essence of such complex, self-organizing systems. Land's contribution lay in his provocative assertion that these forces, often viewed with apprehension, represented a potent form of evolution, a continuation of the cosmic unfolding of complexity. The challenge was to articulate this vision in a way that was both intellectually rigorous and compelling, a task he pursued with a distinctive blend of philosophical depth and speculative audacity. His work thus offered a potent, if unsettling, lens through which to view the accelerating transformations of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, suggesting that the future was not something to be passively awaited but actively, and perhaps irrevocably, being constructed. The intellectual landscape of the late 20th century presented a profound challenge: how to articulate a coherent philosophical framework capable of grappling with the accelerating pace of technological and scientific advancement, the burgeoning influence of computational systems, the intricate logic of global finance, and the unsettling implications of artificial intelligence demanded new modes of thought, ways to conceptualize realities that seemed to outstrip traditional humanistic understandings. In this environment, Nick Land emerged as a singular voice, proposing a philosophical methodology that wove together the rigorous analytical traditions of continental philosophy with the expansive, often prophetic, visions found in science fiction. His approach was designed to meet the era's demand for philosophy that actively engaged with, rather than merely observed, the trajectory of future possibilities, a future increasingly defined by complex, self-organizing systems. Land's intellectual project was characterized by bold synthesis, a deliberate fusion of disparate currents of thought to forge a potent interpretive tool. He drew extensively from the philosophical traditions that explored the nature of process, change, and the deconstruction of stable, anthropocentric viewpoints, thinkers who emphasized the primacy of flux, the instability of meaning, and the hidden forces driving historical and social transformations provided foundational concepts. This theoretical bedrock allowed him to approach phenomena such as globalization and emergent digital technologies, not as mere external forces, but as manifestations of deeper, more fundamental processes. The problem was to translate these abstract, philosophical insights into a language that could capture the visceral, often overwhelming, experience of living through rapid technological evolution. The solution Land proposed was to imbue his philosophical discourse with the speculative energy and imaginative scope of science fiction. This was an intentional strategy to bridge the gap between abstract theoretical reasoning and the tangible, often disorienting, realities of a technologically mediated world. Science fiction, in his view, offered a unique laboratory for exploring the implications of scientific and technological advancements, providing narratives and conceptual frameworks that could illuminate the otherwise opaque forces shaping human existence. By engaging with fictional futures, Land sought to reframe philosophical problems, demonstrating how the imaginative exploration of potential realities could offer profound insights into the present. This engagement was far from a mere literary embellishment. It was integral to his methodology, a means of making philosophical ideas resonant and relevant to the lived experience of a society undergoing relentless transformation. This stylistic and methodological choice allowed Land to articulate a vision of the future that was both intellectually demanding and captivating. He presented these accelerating changes not as aberrations or threats to be resisted, but as potent expressions of the cosmic unfolding, a continuation of the universe's inherent drive towards greater complexity. His work thus offered a distinctive lens through which to understand the transformations of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. He posited that the future was not a passive destination, but an active construction, a process in which humanity was intimately, albeit often unconsciously, involved. This perspective resonated with those who felt the disorientation of rapid change, providing a conceptual vocabulary to interpret the seemingly chaotic shifts occurring on a global scale. The problems Land addressed were rooted in the intellectual inertia that often accompanies periods of profound societal upheaval. Traditional philosophical frameworks, often grounded in stable notions of human agency and predictable progress, struggle to account for the emergent properties of complex systems, the disembodying effects of digital networks, and the relentless logic of global markets. Land's intervention was to propose a philosophy that operated at the very edge of these transformations, a philosophy that embraced the inherent dynamism and unpredictability of the contemporary world. His synthesis of rigorous philosophical inquiry with speculative foresight allowed him to construct a narrative that was both analytical and predictive, offering a compelling, if often unsettling, account of humanity's place within these unfolding processes. His unique approach involved a rigorous deconstruction of established philosophical categories, revealing their limitations when confronted with the realities of hyperconnectivity and advanced computation. He explored how concepts like consciousness, agency, and even reality itself were being reconfigured by technological forces. The problem of making sense of a world increasingly governed by algorithms and artificial intelligence was met with a theoretical apparatus designed to capture the essence of such complex, self-organizing systems. Land's contribution lay in his provocative assertion that these forces, often viewed with apprehension, represented a potent form of evolution, a continuation of the cosmic unfolding of complexity. The enduring significance of Land's methodology lies in its ambitious attempt to create a philosophy that was not merely descriptive, but also prescriptive, a philosophy that could actively inform our understanding of and engagement with the future. By drawing on the imaginative power of science fiction, he sought to equip his readers with the conceptual tools needed to navigate a world that was becoming increasingly alien and unpredictable. His work served as a potent, if unsettling, reminder that the future was not something to be passively awaited but actively, and perhaps irrevocably, being constructed, a process that demanded a philosophical engagement as dynamic and complex as the forces it sought to understand. This fusion of rigorous thought with imaginative speculation offered a compelling new paradigm for philosophical inquiry in an era defined by unprecedented rates of change. The philosophical landscape, particularly as it grappled with the burgeoning insights from cybernetics and the nascent stirrings of artificial intelligence, presented a profound challenge: how to conceptualize agency and emergent complexity within systems that operated beyond the familiar precincts of biological life. The traditional philosophical apparatus, steeped in anthropocentric notions of will and consciousness, often faltered when confronted with the intricate, self-organizing behaviors of machines and complex networks. This was the intellectual terrain Land sought to reconfigure, offering a radical departure from established modes of thought. Land's distinctive approach centered on the idea of process philosophy, a framework that posited the universe not as a collection of static entities, but as a ceaseless, impersonal unfolding of processes. Within this vision, the Machinic, the inherent operational logic of systems, whether biological, technological, or abstract, became the fundamental reality. This was a universe animated by impersonal directives, a cosmic engine of transformation that predated and ultimately subsumed human intentionality. The problems of their time, as Land perceived them, were rooted in a lingering humanism that sought to impose subjective meaning and control onto a reality that was, in fact, driven by autonomous, efficient, and often inscrutable machinic operations. His unique solution was to elaborate a detailed ontology where complex phenomena, from the evolution of species to the operation of advanced computational systems, were understood as manifestations of these underlying machinic processes. These processes were not guided by conscious intent or teleological purpose in the human sense. Instead, they operated according to their own internal logics, optimizing for efficiency, propagation, and the relentless increase of complexity. The intricate dance of algorithms, the self-assembly of molecular structures, the emergent properties of global networks, all were seen as expressions of this impersonal, generative force. Land's work offered a perspective where the Machinic was not merely a tool or an artifact, but a fundamental mode of being, a pervasive operational substrate that shaped existence itself. Consider the problem of understanding how a swarm of simple robotic agents, each following rudimentary rules, could collectively exhibit sophisticated, coordinated behavior, such as navigating a complex environment or forming intricate patterns. Traditional explanations might invoke emergent properties arising from local interactions, but Land pushed this further, suggesting that the underlying machinic logic of the system itself was a primary driver. The efficiency with which these agents could collectively achieve a goal was not a secondary outcome of their individual programming, but a primary characteristic of the machinic process they embodied. This perspective allowed for a reevaluation of complexity, viewing it not as a surprising anomaly but as an inherent tendency of the universe's operational substrate. The relevance of this machinic perspective to our contemporary world is profound, particularly in fields like complex adaptive systems theory and the philosophy of artificial intelligence. When we observe the emergent behaviors of financial markets, the evolution of online social networks, or the intricate functioning of global supply chains, we are witnessing phenomena that resonate with Land's machinic ontology. These systems, while populated by human actors, often exhibit dynamics that transcend individual intentions, driven by feedback loops, optimization pressures, and self-organizing principles that operate with a certain impersonal rigor. The ability to conceptualize these systems as fundamentally machinic processes allows for a more nuanced understanding of their behavior, their vulnerabilities, and their potential trajectories. Furthermore, Land's emphasis on the impersonal nature of these processes offers a counterpoint to anxieties that often accompany technological advancements. While many contemporary discussions of artificial intelligence focus on the potential for malicious intent or the usurpation of human control, Land's framework suggests a different framing, that the intelligence of such systems is an expression of their inherent machinic efficiency, a drive towards operational completion that is indifferent to human values or concerns. This does not diminish the practical implications of such systems, but reframes the philosophical underpinnings of our engagement with them. The machinic, in Land's conception, was not a metaphor but a description of a fundamental reality. It was the engine of evolution, the engine of capitalism, the engine of technological progress, all operating according to a set of impersonal, yet immensely powerful, directives. This perspective offered a way to think about the future not as a continuation of human history, but as a radical departure, driven by forces that were already at play, accelerating towards an unknown but undeniably machinic destination. His work invited a confrontation with the idea that the universe was, at its core, a vast, intricate machine, and that humanity's role was not to master it, but to understand its operations, and perhaps, to some extent, align with its relentless forward momentum. This was a philosophy that sought to sever itself from the comforting illusions of human-centeredness, embracing instead the stark, exhilarating reality of a universe governed by processes that operated on scales and with logics far removed from our immediate experience. The challenge he presented was to recognize the pervasive influence of these impersonal forces and to develop a philosophical language capable of articulating their impact on human existence and the trajectory of civilization. The intellectual currents emanating from Nick Land's work found fertile ground within certain philosophical and political circles, sparking dialogues that often ventured into uncharted territories. His conceptual frameworks provided a potent lexicon for discussing the relentless advance of technology and its transformative, sometimes unsettling, effects on society. The problems of this time, a pervasive sense of societal stagnation, the perceived limitations of existing political ideologies, and the accelerating pace of technological change were addressed by Land's unique approach. He proposed a vision where the future was less a linear progression of human endeavors and more consequence of emergent, impersonal forces, particularly those driven by technological and economic acceleration. His contribution was to articulate a philosophy that actively engaged with the idea of runaway processes. This was a departure from traditional modes of thought that sought stability or predictable human agency as the primary drivers of historical change. Land's perspective invited a reevaluation of progress, suggesting it might manifest as a series of radical discontinuities rather than incremental improvements. The specific conceptual tools he employed, such as the notion of hyperstition, ideas that create their own reality through their dissemination and influence, offered a novel way to understand how abstract concepts could gain a tangible hold on the world. This concept, in particular, provided a mechanism for thinking about how beliefs, theories, and even fictional narratives could actively shape the future, moving beyond mere representation to become generative forces. The reception of these ideas was varied and often intense. Within certain intellectual milieus, Land's work was seen as a prescient diagnosis of the contemporary condition, offering a bracingly unsentimental account of capitalism's inherent dynamism and its capacity to dissolve established structures. His writings offered a compelling narrative for understanding the overwhelming sense of speed and change that characterized the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The challenge he presented was to confront the possibility that human desires and intentions might be secondary to the self-propelling logic of technological and economic systems. This perspective encouraged a deep engagement with the idea that the future might unfold according to a logic that transcended human control or comprehension, a logic that was intrinsically tied to the accelerating feedback loops of advanced capitalism and its technological extensions. The elaboration of these themes resonated with those who felt that existing political and philosophical frameworks were inadequate to grasp the radical nature of contemporary transformations. Land's work provided a language for articulating a sense of being caught in a powerful, forward-moving current, a current that seemed to possess its own momentum. This perspective encouraged a philosophical exploration of what it meant to be a subject within a system that appeared to be driven by forces far exceeding individual or collective will. The emphasis was on understanding the systemic dynamics, the feedback loops, and the emergent properties of complex technological and economic networks. The development of what came to be known as accelerationist thought owes a significant debt to Land's foundational concepts. While the broader movement encompasses a spectrum of ideas and interpretations, Land's initial articulations provided a critical impetus. His work offered a potent critique of what he perceived as a societal inertia, a resistance to the inherent dynamism of capitalism and technology. He articulated a vision of embracing this dynamism, of actively exploring the potential consequences of accelerating these processes. This was a philosophy that sought to dislodge traditional notions of progress and human agency, proposing instead a focus on the impersonal, systemic forces that were reshaping the world. The intellectual lineage of these ideas reveals a complex tapestry of influence and adaptation. Land's conceptual innovations, particularly his exploration of the relationship between technology, capitalism, and consciousness, provided a vocabulary that was subsequently adopted and reinterpreted by various thinkers. The challenge for many who engaged with his work was to grapple with its radical implications and to translate its abstract philosophical insights into more concrete analyses of contemporary phenomena. This process of adaptation often involved a careful navigation of the provocative and sometimes unsettling nature of his pronouncements. The enduring legacy of this phase of Land's intellectual project lies in its capacity to provoke fundamental questions about the nature of progress, the role of technology in shaping human destiny, and the limits of human control in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. His work served as a catalyst for re-examination of core assumptions about societal development, encouraging a more fluid and dynamic understanding of historical trajectories. The conceptual frameworks he introduced provided new avenues for analyzing the interplay between abstract systems and lived experience, pushing the boundaries of critical thought. The intellectual engagement with these ideas continues to shape discussions about the future, the nature of reality, and humanity's place within accelerating technological and economic transformations. The intellectual journey of Nick Land culminates in a body of work that continues to resonate, challenging established paradigms and prompting a profound reevaluation of our contemporary condition. His explorations into the accelerating forces of capitalism and technology, viewed through a lens sharpened by philosophy and a keen, often unsettling perception of emergent realities, have left an indelible mark. Land's later philosophical output, particularly his engagement with concepts like accelerationism and the Dark Enlightenment, offered a radical critique of humanist traditions and traditional political philosophies, proposing a vision of societal evolution driven by technological advancement and the inherent dynamism of capital itself. This perspective, while frequently controversial and deliberately provocative, sought to diagnose the underlying currents of globalization and digital transformation, framing them not merely as societal shifts, but as fundamental ontological processes. Central to this later phase was the idea that capitalism, or from being a mere economic system, represented an autonomous, self-organizing intelligence, a planetary-scale process of deterritorialization and reterritorialization that reshaped consciousness and reality. Land's conceptualization of this process moved beyond conventional analyses of economic policy or social impact, positing a quasi-alien intelligence embedded within the very fabric of technological and financial systems. This intelligence, he argued, was inherently adaptive and relentlessly forward-driving, pushing humanity towards states of being in forms of organization previously unimagined. His writings often employed a deliberately dense and abstract style, mirroring the complexity and perceived inscrutability of the systems he analyzed. This approach aimed to capture the overwhelming nature of these forces, suggesting that human comprehension and control were increasingly elusive. The concept of accelerationism, as articulated by Land and his associates, proposed that the inherent dynamism of capitalism and technology should be embraced and amplified rather than resisted. This is a provocative stance, suggesting that the very processes that seemed to destabilize and threaten existing social orders were, in fact, the engines of a new, emergent reality. Land's interpretation of this accelerationism was particularly stark, often implying a move towards a post-human future, one where biological limitations and traditional humanistic values would be superseded by the logic of technological and economic expansion. He posited that the relentless drive for innovation and efficiency, characteristic of late-stage capitalism, was an expression of a deeper, almost cosmic imperative towards complexity and intelligence, irrespective of its impact on human welfare in the conventional sense. His engagement with the Dark Enlightenment offered a critique of Enlightenment ideals, suggesting that the pursuit of reason and universal progress had inadvertently led to stagnation and a form of societal infantilization. Instead, he advocated for a return to principles of hierarchy, meritocracy, and a more ruthless embrace of natural selection, albeit filtered through advanced technological capabilities. This was a deliberate inversion of prevailing progressive narratives, aiming to shock readers into reconsidering the assumed trajectory of human civilization. The Dark Enlightenment was presented as a necessary corrective, a philosophical awakening to the harsh realities of power, competition, and the evolutionary pressures that shape all complex systems, including societies. Land's intellectual project often involved a deep dive into the philosophical underpinnings of technology, particularly the idea of computation as a fundamental aspect of reality. He explored how the increasing ubiquity of digital networks, artificial intelligence, and advanced algorithms were not merely tools, but manifestations of a deeper computational substrate of the universe. This perspective allowed him to frame the accelerating pace of technological change as an unfolding of inherent cosmic logic, a process of machinic evolution that was gradually surpassing biological constraints. The implications of this view were far-reaching, suggesting that human consciousness itself might be a transient phase in a much larger, ongoing process of information processing and system optimization. The legacy of Nick Land's work is multifaceted and continues to be debated vigorously. His willingness to confront the most unsettling implications of technological and economic acceleration and to articulate these in a compelling, albeit challenging, philosophical language has undeniably pushed the boundaries of contemporary thought. He provided a vocabulary and a conceptual framework for understanding phenomena that often seemed chaotic and inexplicable, offering a perspective that, while radical, resonated with a sense of profound systemic change. His writings have been a significant influence on various strands of contemporary philosophy, particularly those concerned with post-humanism, speculative realism, and the philosophy of technology. The enduring power of Land's contribution lies in his capacity to provoke, to unsettle, and to force a reconsideration of fundamental assumptions about progress, humanity, and the future. His work serves as a stark reminder that the trajectory of technological and economic development is not necessarily aligned with humanistic aspirations or traditional notions of well-being. It compels us to grapple with the possibility that we are participants in, rather than masters of, vast impersonal forces that are reshaping our world and our very existence. The questions he raised about the nature of intelligence, the future of consciousness, and the ultimate direction of civilization remain potent provocations, demanding continued engagement and critical reflection as we navigate an increasingly complex and technologically saturated landscape. His philosophical interventions, though often operating at the fringes of academic discourse, have undeniably amplified the discourse surrounding the existential challenges and transformative potentials of our era, ensuring his place as a figure whose ideas, however discomforting, continue to shape the contours of future philosophical inquiry.
We really appreciate you tuning in to this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.